If the Fellowship of the Ring was to succeed, then nothing was more important than maintaining secrecy. This is why the Fellowship is small, it's why they take the rough path through the wilderness, and it's why they even brave the dark of Moria. But on the 26th of February, the Fellowship proves to be not so secret, for they are attacked by Orcs at Amon Hen. Boromir is slain, Merry and Pippin are captured, and the Fellowship is broken. So the question is, how did the Orcs know to find the Fellowship at Amon Hen? If you've only ever seen the films, you might be confused as to how Saruman's Uruk-hai managed to find the Fellowship. We see him send them out, but it's never explained how they knew exactly where to find them. At this point, you might expect me to say, well, the books explain it. But here's the thing, they don't. Not really. And in fact, the attack at Amon Hen is even more complex than the books, because it's not just Saruman's Uruks that are present, there's also Moria Orcs and Mordor Orcs. While there are hints that the Fellowship's passage isn't as secret as they would like it to be, such as Legolas shooting down the Nazgul over the Anduin and the ambush by Orc archers at Sangabir, it's still never explained how exactly the Fellowship were located near to Amon Hen. The reason this information isn't in the books is because the books are from the perspective of Frodo and the other members of the Fellowship. They can piece together some things from outside their perspectives. Gandalf, for example, is quite good at this, but some things are lost to them, and them being found at Amon Hen is one of those things. Aragorn's only thought on the event is, by some means the traitor Saruman has had news of our journey, and pursuers from Moria may have escaped the vigilance of Lorien. The location of the Fellowship's whereabouts, originally stemming from Moria Orcs, is a good hypothesis, but it doesn't explain to us how Isengard and Mordor both ended up involved. Fortunately, there is behind-the-scenes information, courtesy of Tolkien writing down plenty of notes and even creating a spreadsheet of sorts that followed character movements. These spreadsheets are kind of difficult to read, but fortunately they made their way into the Lord of the Rings Reader's Companion. This isn't the only time that the Reader's Companion is incredibly useful in deciphering events. A significant chunk of the Hunt for the Ring, mostly featured in the Unfinished Tales, can only be found in the Reader's Companion. From that, we get a much better idea of what the Nazgul were doing while hunting for Frodo. Alright, so Aragorn is correct in his assumption. The Moria Orcs were vital in the Fellowship being located. On the 15th of January 3019, the Fellowship escaped Moria. Angry that the Fellowship slew one of their chieftains, the Moria Orcs attempt to pursue them into Lothlorien but are repulsed. Unwilling to accept defeat, but also realizing that the Fellowship were currently beyond them, the Moria Orcs send out messages to both Isengard and Mordor. The messages to Isengard are delivered by foot, and the ones to Mordor are delivered by evil birds. Not only does the message mention what has happened, but it also mentions an appearance of Gollum. Both messages arrive by the 18th. Both Saruman and Sauron instantly react. Sauron sends out Grishnak and a company of orcs. Grishnak appears to be quite a high-ranking orc. He's familiar with Gollum, seems to know a fair amount about Saruman, and he even seems to know about the existence of the One Ring. Saruman, however, initially just sends out a few scouts led by the Uruk, Ugluk. The reason Saruman doesn't send out a greater force is that he's still trying to play the part of being Sauron's servant rather than his rival, even though Sauron deeply distrusts Saruman by this point. Seemingly, Saruman doesn't want to make a play for the One Ring until he's certain he can snatch it. On the 22nd, Ugluk and his scouts reach Moria. They gather a force of mountain orcs, and the text implies that they might have tried to gain entry to Lothlorien again. This fails, so they resolve to pull back and watch the forest from afar, specifically keeping a close eye on the river exit. 2 days later, Ugluk strikes gold by managing to capture Gollum, who reveals that Gandalf and the hobbits were present. Gollum escapes afterwards, but Ugluk has enough information to be sure that the Fellowship are carrying this so-called elvish weapon, the One Ring. He dispatches messengers back to Saruman, but the messengers are specifically not told about the One Ring. This turns out to be important because 2 days later, on the 26th, Grishnak crosses the Anduin and ends up intercepting Ugluk's messengers. He learns the news, allows them to leave, retreats back across the Anduin where he makes contact with one of the Nazgul at Sangabir, and then awaits further orders. From what Ugluk's messengers told him, Grishnak probably deduced the presence of the One Ring. All the signs were there: Gandalf, Gollum, and halflings. However, the fact that Ugluk's messengers did not mention the One Ring because they were not told about it may have given Saruman plausible deniability when it came to knowing about what the Fellowship carried. On the 30th, Ugluk's messengers finally reach Isengard. Once again, they don't know about the One Ring, but Saruman can also deduce its presence. He decides the time to act is now, so he sends out a stronger force to meet Ugluk, and with orders to take the halflings alive, but to kill everyone else. A few days later, on the 2nd of February, Grishnak is also reinforced and is ordered to cooperate with Ugluk. It's said at this point that Sauron did not yet suspect Saruman. I do have to admit here that this bit does confuse me because the statement of Sauron not yet suspecting Saruman is very vague. It surely cannot mean that Sauron did not suspect Saruman to be a traitor, because the hunt for the ring tells us that Sauron had been suspicious of Saruman for a while, and Saruman attempting to misdirect the Nazgul all but confirmed his traitorous intentions. I can then only interpret this statement in two ways. Either Sauron believed that Saruman was not aware that the Fellowship was carrying the One Ring, so working with him wasn't dangerous, or that Sauron wasn't aware that Ugluk was working for Saruman. After all, Ugluk was mostly commanding Moria Orcs at this point. But the problem with this is that when Grishnak intercepted the messengers, surely he asked where they were going. During this time, the Fellowship was still in Lothlorien. On the 6th of February, Ugluk seems to have abandoned watching the forest and instead scoured northern Rohan. I'm not exactly sure why. On the 10th, Ugluk ends up at Sangabir where he makes contact with Grishnak, and the two seem to prepare an ambush at the rapids. However, Ugluk's presence in northern Rohan has attracted the attention of the Rohirrim, not Eomer's band, but a separate group, and they drive the Isengarders south from the rapids and they retreat into Emyn Muil on the western side of the Anduin. So, well before the Fellowship arrive, Ugluk is already near Amon Hen. Grishnak's company continues to watch from the eastern bank. On the 16th, the Fellowship finally leave Lothlorien, and on the 22nd, Grishnak finally gets word of their approach. One of the Nazgul is summoned, but Sauron forbids him from crossing the Anduin, probably out of safety concerns. On the 23rd, the Fellowship pass through Sangabir, and Orc archers fire at them. But because the west bank isn't guarded, the Fellowship are able to find safety there, and even worse for the ambushers, Legolas manages to shoot down the Nazgul, who crashes down beyond the eastern shore. The Orcs are dismayed, but Grishnak isn't about to give up that easily. Believing that the Fellowship must be making for Minas Tirith, he leads his Orcs across the river and pursues his targets down the western shore. On the 25th, the Fellowship land at Parth Galen and make camp for the night. During the night, Aragorn asks Frodo to draw Sting, and it glows faintly blue, warning them that Orcs are in the area, but not overly close by. Aragorn guesses that there might be Orc spies patrolling Amon Lao on the eastern side of the river, and that he has never heard of Orcs roaming Amon Hen. That said, he isn't confident enough to assume that this is the case. Interestingly enough, given that the Fellowship managed to spend the entire evening at Parth Galen without incident, it seemed to be that Ugluk and his company were not watching the river, and were not aware of the Fellowship's presence, even though they were close enough to set off Sting. Although not watching the river is certainly an interesting choice, you do have to remember that Ugluk was driven south about a week before the Fellowship left Lothlorien. So, unlike Grishnak, he had no idea that the Fellowship were heading south. This would have only changed when Grishnak finally met up with Ugluk again, also on the 25th, but almost certainly after the Fellowship had reached Parth Galen. Otherwise, the Orcs might have already been waiting there for them. Thus, we finally arrive at the 26th, the day the Fellowship is attacked. The fact that the Fellowship wasn't attacked until around noon tells us that even when Grishnak met Ugluk, he must have still been a fair distance from Parth Galen. Logically, the shores of the Anduin should have been the first place that Ugluk and Grishnak searched, because the Fellowship was travelling by boat. But it seems they were searching in a wider arc, because Legolas and Gimli would actually later encounter Orcs on the western side of Amon Hen. Fortunately for them, the departure of the Fellowship was delayed because Boromir scared Frodo off, and then they were drawn to the shouts of Merry and Pippin, who were searching for Frodo. So they found them first, killed Boromir who was defending them, and then satisfied that the mission had been achieved, they left. So it wasn't the case that Saruman unleashed Ugluk from Isengard, and that he went straight towards the Fellowship like a homing missile, intercepting them at Amon Hen. The reality is, the Fellowship was being watched and pursued the moment they left Moria, and during their month's stay, both Sauron and Saruman had become aware of where they were, what they were carrying, and had sent forces to intercept them. And even though they couldn't touch the Fellowship in Lothlorien, they knew that the only logical direction for them to head was south, and the fastest and probably safest way south was down the river. So it's not that the Fellowship was unlucky to have been attacked at Amon Hen, they're actually lucky they even made it that far. But as I said in my video about Aragorn's plan, the Fellowship probably still could have gotten away at Amon Hen. If Boromir hadn't scared Frodo off, the Fellowship might have departed as many as 2 hours earlier, either by crossing to the eastern side of the river or taking the north stair down the falls of Rauros, or both. Those crossing the river would have been safe from the pursuit of Orcs because they would have had no way to cross, and those taking the north stair might have gotten away because the Orcs probably weren't aware of that path. But that small window of opportunity closed, and the Fellowship, or at least part of it, was found. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. Background information like this encapsulates both the joy, yet also frustration in being a fan of Tolkien's work. There's an answer to every question, but if you want to find that answer, you have to go trawling through 10 different books. Maybe the Tolkien estate should actually release a 10,000 page monstrosity that has all of Tolkien's work in one place. Cheers, farewell, and remember, characters meet each other randomly all of the time in Middle-earth, but when Orcs want to do it, they have to work hard for it.